So, a few years ago, I had this idea for a class. The class would be called Rugged Individualism. And if you're not familiar with the term rugged individualism, let me give you a little background. Rugged individualism was a term coined by Herbert Hoover to describe the type of person that would go out into the American frontier and forge a path for themselves without the support or intervention of the American government. This idea would later be picked up by conservative politicians and the Republican Party as a whole in opposition to what they believed was the nanny state or big government liberalism. My class would be a little different because for me, this class would be about teaching it through the biography and life of one person. So I had to choose someone who was born poor, came from a modest background, someone who did not accept government support, grew up to be a success in spite of those things, and also someone who prides themselves on civil liberties. So I already knew who I was going to choose, but I wanted to go out and ask my friends and colleagues what they thought. And one of the most common reactions was that I should choose Ronald Reagan. And I said, well, I know that Reagan is the icon for conservatism, but I don't think he would fit the purposes that I'm going for. And some people said that I should choose Abraham Lincoln. And while Lincoln is probably our poorest president, you know, the log cabin myth and all, he still wasn't what I was looking for. Some people thought that I should choose George W. Bush. And the former president would not necessarily fit the idea that I was going for a rugged individualist. So people would say, after all of this, they would say, well, tell us who you would choose as your perfect example of a rugged individual. And I said, my perfect example of a rugged individual would be Malcolm X. And the life of Malcolm X and the autobiography of Malcolm X would be the textbook for my class. And so people would say, well, that seems weird. Why would you use someone who most consider a 1960s black radical as your idea for a conservative political idea? Well, I said, well, just look at his life. Malcolm X grew up poor in the Midwest. He didn't accept anything from the government. In fact, he didn't accept anything from the government because the government was systematically set up against people like him because of institutional racism. He grew up to be successful, and he valued his civil liberties, specifically the Second Amendment. And the reason that I would take Malcolm X as the perfect example of rugged individualism is because when I look at the history of America, and specifically black history, because most of my work is about that, I look at it on the backdrop of all history. And I make the connections that we don't necessarily make when we look at those things within Black History Month. Let me give you another example. Growing up in the South, in Virginia, whenever we talked about Black History Month, we usually talked about two people. We talked about Jackie Robinson and Dr. Martin Luther King. And when you look at Dr. King and Jackie Robinson's life, you start to find one thing that connects them. When you look at Dr. King, you start thinking about, you know, this 27-year-old minister who was thrown into the Montgomery bus boycott, this boycott that was supposed to last 2 weeks, that lasted over a year. He used that momentum to springboard onto the national stage and become a tireless fighter for civil rights for black people in the South. Jackie Robinson, on the other hand, was an amazing athlete. When Jackie Robinson broke the color line by joining the Brooklyn Dodgers, he was the first black player to play in Major League Baseball since the 1880s. He went on to have a very successful life after baseball. He was the first black vice president of a major American corporation, chock full of nuts, and then he started a bank called Freedom National Bank. The thing that connects, when you look at Dr. King and Jackie Robinson in the context of Black History Month, there is one thing that connects them. They're both black. However, if you take them out of the context of Black History Month and you look at Dr. King, you start to find that there are much clearer connections for Dr. King with other people within American history. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the women's rights activist. Cesar Chavez, the workers' rights activist, and Harvey Milk. And in reality, if you take Martin Luther King and look at him and Harvey Milk, their lives are really close together. But the fact that we don't connect those people is because we have relegated the histories of minority peoples into one period every year. By taking them and putting them in that one period, we don't make the connections that we should be making. And I started to think about this when I was doing the research for my book, Strange Fruit, Uncelebrated Narratives from Black History. And there were two stories in The Strange Fruit that actually stuck out for me here. It was the story of Henry Box Brown. Henry Box Brown was a slave who mailed himself in a box from Virginia to Philadelphia to escape from slavery to freedom. He was in this box for 27 hours, on boats, on carts, until he arrived in Philadelphia. When he arrived in Philadelphia, other than probably having to go to the bathroom really bad, he began to talk about and speak out against slavery. He became an abolitionist. He would go on tours. He would talk to people. He eventually became an entertainer. Then he wrote a book called Mirror. When the 1857 Fugitive Slave Act went into effect, he left America and he ended up in Manchester, England. The other story is about the first American stage magician, Richard Potter, who was a black man from New Hampshire. And I moved to New Hampshire about 7 or 8 years ago, and I realized one thing, that when I leave the state, I significantly decrease the black population by leaving the state of New Hampshire. So you can imagine what it was like for Richard Potter when he was running around in the United States performing in the early 1800s. So he traveled up and down the East Coast. At one point, he was the most successful entertainer in America. He ended up settling in Potter's Place, New Hampshire. It wasn't called Potter's Place until after he had died. And Potter's biggest illusion was tricking the American public into thinking that he was white when he was actually black. And what these two people brought to mind was the idea of the Horatio Alger story. This idea that there are these people who, by the force of their character and the force of will of who they are, they go out into the world and make a way for themselves. They go from rags to riches. But the reality of that story is the Horatio Alger story is a myth. Horatio Alger Jr. was a man who wrote books about these men who did these things. There weren't real people. It was just a common theme. But for people like Henry Box Brown and Richard Potter, this wasn't a myth. This was fact. They went from being livestock to being successful. And because we look at these people within the context of black history, we don't make the connection that the real Horatio Alger stories in America is black America. In 500 years, we went from being livestock to presidents. One of the other connections that I found when thinking about these things was the story of Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves is the subject of my second book, which is called Tales of the Talented Tenth. Bass Reeves was a slave who got into a fight with his slave master and knocked him out over a poker game. And then Bass ran to Indian Territory, where he lived for a number of years until a band of Union soldiers came through, and he joined the Union Army. He stayed in the Union Army until the end of the war, and then he left and went to Texas, where he settled. He settled in Texas, and he became a scout for the U.S. Marshals. And ultimately, Bass became one of the first black U.S. Marshals in American history. He would dress in disguises. He could not read or write, so he would travel for long periods of time. After he would memorize a warrant, he would go out for 21 days at a time into Indian Territory. And because he couldn't read or write, he would often leave a silver coin behind as a token that he had been there. Now, I'm not sure if it sounds familiar to you, but it should, because a lot of historians believe that Bass Reeves was the original inspiration for the Lone Ranger, which is an amazing thing. And people say, well, Joel, why doesn't anyone know about the Lone Ranger? Why don't we know about his story? Why don't we know this? The reason why is because when the writers of the story for the Lone Ranger started to come up with the idea for it, they didn't think that this guy would relate to all the little white kids in America who were listening to radio shows. They thought it would be this guy. Because we have disconnected the history of minority people, we have relegated that history to one 28-day period every 12 months. So I've come here today to enlist your help because I am trying to start a movement. The movement is called 28 Days Are Not Enough. And because we have relegated the history of black people and minority people to one 28-day period or to one small section of American history, we've missed large portions of the history that connects us. I got this idea from my sister. I was doing an interview over the summer. And while I was in the interview, my sister was tweeting at me because this is the modern times. And she said to me, I said to her something to the effect of, we should be talking about this history 365 days out of the year. And she said, I'm with you, little brother. She said, because 28 days are not enough. And I'm like, I'm going to steal your idea. So, Tiffany, if you're watching, thank you. The 28 days are not enough is an idea that this history does not just belong to me. It's not just black history. I came here with my friend and my wife today, and my friend Drew, and if he and I were to go to Africa right now, they would see two Americans. They would not see a black man and a white man. And the interesting thing about that is that we have a tendency to separate ourselves out into these different categories, whereas other people in the world don't separate us like that. 28 days are not enough when talking about our history because the history of America and the culture of America is so rich. By separating out black people, we've taken out the history of the people who built this country, and we've separated it out. And we've said, this is their history, this is your history. Well, I'm here to tell you that black history is my history and your history. It is everybody's history. So when you leave here today, what I want you to do is if you know a bookseller or a librarian or someone who books speakers, specifically speakers, tell them that I will take their money any time of the year. It does not have to be Black History Month. If you have someone who is a bookseller, tell them that during Black History Month to ignore that idea, which sounds scary. I understand. It sounds scary. And people have said to me, but if we ignore Black History Month in the context of black people, our stories will be marginalized. And I'm like, no, it's not going to be marginalized because it's going to be our responsibility to go out and make it history every day, to make those connections, to tell people that during Black History Month, we're no longer going to talk about Black history and Jackie Robinson and Martin Luther King. We're going to put Martin Luther King up, and we're going to put Harvey Milk up, and we're going to talk about riots, because riots are what people do in America. From the Boston Tea Party to the Tea Party in 2010, from the Watts riots to the Stonewall riots, that's what connects us. That's the history that connects us. That's why 28 days are not enough. This is my history just as much as it is your history. It is the history of not them people or those people. It's we the people. 28 days are not enough when talking about our history, and neither are 29. Thank you.